Hello, welcome to this video where we're going to look at how you view a supply chain. So in a previous video, we saw the different phases of decisions in supply chains. One of the phases is how you design a supply chain. So when you're designing a supply chain, or even when you're planning for a supply chain, it is important to know how to look at a supply chain. And the way you view a supply chain usually informs the way you end up designing it and end up planning for it. So there are two major ways of looking at a supply chain. The first is the cycle view, and the second is the push-pull view. So in the cycle view, the processes in a supply chain are divided into series of cycles, each performed at the interface between two successive stages. So this is more like a company view. So you have a company that has a whole process set up, and you deal with your supplier and you deal with your customer, and you might be an intermediate stage in the supply chain, but then it is a cycle view. So, and in push-pull view, the processes in supply chain are divided into two categories depending upon when they are executed, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So let's first look at the cycle view. So the cycle view of supply chain is here is an example, a nice way of looking at a cycle view of supply chain. You have the customer order cycle. For the retailer, you have the replenishment cycle, and the distributor is at the retailer is at the cusp of at the intersection of the customer order cycle and the replenishment cycle. The distributor is at the intersection of replenishment and the manufacturing cycle, and the manufacturer is at the intersection of procurement and manufacturing cycle, and the supplier runs the procurement cycle, basically, right? So this is a simple way of looking at a cycle view of supply chain. So customers, say a customer wants to buy salt, they go to a place like Walmart where they go and they buy salt, and they buy salt every so often. So that's the customer order cycle. So for a retailer like Walmart, you are not the only customer. There are many customers who come in. So all of those customers, they buy salt on a regular basis. So the retailer notices this and then realizes how the customers are buying it, and then decides on how to replenish the amount of salt they have on their shelves. So then that's part of the replenishment cycle. Now for the distributor, Walmart might not be the only place where they're selling their salt. They might be selling it to small mom and pop stores, and also to Target and other places, and say Kroger's and Wegmans and all of these other places. So they also have to go look at their customers and run manufacturing. So talk to the manufacturer so that the manufacturer can run their manufacturing cycle and so on. So that's the cycle view of a supply chain, right? So the supplier stage markets the product, the buyer stage places the order, supplier stage receives the order, supply stage supplies the order, buyer stage receives the supply, buyer returns reverse flows to the third party. So this is the simple thing that happens within that chain. So the cycle view of supply chain clearly defines the processes involved and the owners of each process. And that's the key point here, that you define these processes and you have individual owners for these processes. So this is almost like you are segregating companies within a supply chain and saying, okay, you are responsible for this piece of the supply chain and you are responsible for this piece of the supply chain, and so on. I mean, this is what happens in most real life cases, except when large companies are involved, right? So if you have a company like, say, General Motors, and they're buying nuts and bolts for their cars, right? So they have all of these suppliers that they have who supply nuts and bolts, and all they do is supply nuts and bolts to GE. That is all they do, right? So in a case like that, GE can dictate what they do with their supply chain also. So it's not always the case that a company is by itself and can only deal with its customer and its supplier. Sometimes there are other parts of supply chain that can dictate what happens, right? And you can have government regulations and all of that. So this is one way of looking at a supply chain. Another way of looking at a supply chain is called the push-pull view of a supply chain. Push-pull view says that there is a certain point. So you have all of these processes that are part of a supply chain, everything going from raw materials all the way to a retailer and then the customer. Now, it comes down to where does the customer place their order, right? So if the customer places their orders here, it means that all of these processes here are pull processes, which means that they can do their job after the customer places the order, but all the push processes are pushing towards the customer order. Pull processes pull from the customer order, push processes push towards the customer order, which means that all of these companies that are part of the push process here, they are making their individual product or part of the final product before the customer places their order. And all of these companies and all of these processes are happening post customer order, right? So they know exactly what customer orders are and exactly how much to make, as opposed to these processes which don't. And there are different ways of looking at it. So let's look at a few examples, right? So the push-pull boundary separates the customer orders from the push process from the pull processes, and it's a customer order that is at the boundary. Here is an example. Say, for example, if you look at LL Bean. So in LL Bean, what happens is all the manufacturing, replenishment, all of those cycles happen before the customer order arrives. Once the customer order arrives, all the customer is doing is going to an LL Bean store or Macy's or some store where LL Bean is sold and just buying it, right? The customer is going to a store and buying LL Bean products. So everything, all the manufacturing, all the packaging, all the marketing, all of that happens before the customer buys the product. As opposed to, say, if you go to a place like Ethan Allen, right, that makes Ethan Allen, where only the procurement cycle happens before the customer order arrives, because they manufacture stuff. All the manufacturing happens after the customer places an order, because most of what you buy from Ethan Allen is custom made stuff. Because you're buying custom made stuff, you place your order, and then once your order is placed, you probably pay a deposit or something like that, and then they manufacture what you want, and then they send it to your house. So here, most of the processes are pull processes. Only the procurement process is a push process, as opposed to LL Bean, where most of the processes are push processes, and only the customer order part is the pull process, right? So that's the difference between companies like Ethan Allen and LL Bean. So for example, let's say that you're a very small company and you want antivirus software for your company. You probably go to Best Buy and you buy an off-the-shelf product that your IT can install, that one IT person in your company installs, and it is done. But if you're a company like, say, a huge company like, say, American Express, you probably have in-house people writing custom software to do internet security, or you hire a third-party company which comes to your company, looks at what you need to do, and then prepares a specialized product for you, right? In both of these cases, it's still internet security software, antivirus software, but in one case, you as a customer are just buying a pre-made product, and in another case, a company comes in and then you tell them what your specifications are, and they build a product specifically for you. So the push-pull boundary is very different, even though the product is exactly the same, right? And that's how you view a product. So a push-pull view of supply chain categorizes processes into whether they are pull processes or push processes, right? So this is the different views of supply chain, and as we go through these videos, you'll notice there are different pieces of the supply chain that we talk about, and I will see you in the next video.